So, as you've kind of been hearing already a little bit, games have become increasingly central to ideas of engagement, particularly of younger audiences in recent years. I think the principle is, well, kids play games, right? And partly as a result of this, and as a result of this tendency towards the digital, a range of things have been produced that are either, I suppose, specifically identified as games, or which focus on similar sets of elements, so things like augmented reality overlays, decision trees, things like that. A few examples that I've come across, a game called Archie's Cave, which is produced to encourage engagement with the marble arch caves in Ireland. Oh Fabulous, which is a multiplayer online heritage game produced by a researcher at the University of Versailles. And a game called Strawberry Thief, which if you know any of them, you'll probably know that one, was produced by Sophia George, who was the game designer in residence at the V&A. And the V&A itself is actually looking towards a 27 exhibition on contemporary video games design. But you also have to remember that games and play have been at the core of engagement practices for both children and adults for many years, although not always branded as such. For example, the encouragement to play things like croquet at heritage properties. And large-scale non-digital games have been developed very successfully in recent years, for example, by an award-winning designer called Holly Gramazio, who led the New Year Games Festival in Edinburgh in 2012, which encouraged some 12,000 members of the public to get involved in mass play.
Right, so our original intention for today was to talk through the post-mortem of an archive and game project, looking in particular at the relationship between the archivists and the game designers, and how that relationship had been managed by artists who'd brought the project together. When we wrote our abstract back in May, it was all going swimmingly. Main planning meeting was just around the corner, game jam was about to take place. Unfortunately, we're not really in a position yet to tell you more about the success or otherwise of the project, due to a number of matters arising, including, sadly, bereavement for one of the organisers. Things have taken rather longer than expected. So today, the main planning meeting is still just around the corner. It's happening at the end of this month, and the game jam will take place within the next 3 months. The project organisers are a Birmingham-based arts collective, We Are Frilly, and they're trying to whip everything back into shape and get things back on the rails. As you can see here, there's been a few interruptions.
So what we've come to understand, though, in the environment of uncertainty around the project, and this is the project that seems to have disappeared completely at some points before reappearing again, is perhaps there's a clear sense of the inherent tensions at the heart of activities like this, the complexity of the relationships between the communities involved, and the importance throughout all of it of the idea of play. The problems the project's faced have made us as academics think, I suppose, harder about these processes, and it's created a valuable space for reflection, as we're hopefully going to demonstrate to you in this presentation.
So, the project, how did it come about? It's from a funding opportunity from Arts Connect West Midlands under their Research and Development programme. Arts Connect is the regional bridge organisation funded to bring young people together with arts and culture. The project itself is the brainchild of We Are Frilly. Whose the aim, We Are Frilly's aim was to bring archivists and game designers together in the medium of a game jam, to do something, for want of a better phrase, gamesy in some way with archives. The artists who run the arts organisation, it's a picture of a games jam, both play games, albeit of different kinds, and we're avoiding the politics of the term gamer here on purpose, and anyone who's familiar with Gamergate will know why. I've had an education about it through this project. And the artists united in seeing an opportunity here to exploit archive materials within a gaming space. So importantly, this is a project originated neither by archivists nor by game developers, and one that's also originated specifically by female game players. It's one of 3 that Arts Connect are funding with what was formerly called the West Midlands Archives Forum, now known as Archives West Midlands. And the participating archives from Archives West Midlands represent a number of different types of archive, from the traditional regional records office, a university arts archive, to an independent heritage charity. For these archives, the project presents an opportunity to, in the words of the funding agreement, work with the gaming industry and the university to develop games for children and young people, introducing them to archive collections. So that's the brief as such. What we actually have in this project is the coming together of 5 different communities. We have first the artists, who are running the show, and the archivists, who are working with the collections, the raw materials. We have the academics, us, studying what's happening here and contributing some expertise around creative practice and archives and the gaming industry. We have the audiences who will engage with whatever this product is, the game itself. And then we have the game designers. And apologies, we tried our best, but it doesn't begin with A. Game designers, but the people who will make whatever it is that these audiences are going to engage with. Now, each of these different communities brings a set of expectations and assumptions about what the project could deliver, what it will entail, and these in turn are shaping the relationships that the communities have with the project and with each other. There are different perspectives and potential clashes of culture, and these are manifesting themselves in tensions around the project activity.
So, to some extent, this reflects the broader environment of game making, in which there's a clearer sense, I suppose, that this is a process characterised by tension. So, online you can see massively multiplayer games which have been the scene of riots or sit-ins. Players are increasingly conceived of as participants in the creation of games rather than simply as audiences for them. And there's actually an academic viewpoint that says a game isn't finished until someone's playing it. It doesn't become a text until there's interaction. So alongside this, you've got tensions between developers, who usually want to make the best games they can, and publishers, who usually want them made as quickly as possible for as little money as possible. And so we shouldn't perhaps be surprised that this is this kind of process of characterised by tension, I guess, continues to have these tensions in it when it comes to cultural production around the archive, so a cultural space.
So, of course, the project evidences tensions that you might expect whenever different sectors and work cultures come together, around speed of response, levels of communication and so on. It's very novel for us not to be the last people responding to an email. But these minor issues, which are anyway grounded in the resourcing problems, the funding climate that we all operate in now, are far less important than the assumptions that the people are bringing to the discussions. Instructive examples are perhaps the perceptions of games themselves and the purpose of producing a game in this way in the first place. So what do we even mean by game, and what kind of games are we comfortable with? Here you see examples of some of the types of popular or well-known digital games, ones that even I've heard of. Angry Birds, Grand Theft Auto, Tomb Raider, Mario Kart, all of which exist in the popular psyche around a modern idea of games as video games. However, in discussion with archivists in our project, their gaming experience and engagement is far more traditional, rooted in something perhaps a bit more like this: the traditional board game. And in fact, the archivists we spoke to drew a distinction between traditional games and gaming, or gamer games, with at least one suggesting that gaming implied some sort of obsessive gameplay, as opposed to a more traditional, and in one interpretation, a less digital form of games. The artists, whose ideas initially animated the project, had a third and different perspective, a fusion more of traditional and modern constructions of games, based on the contemporary board game market. These were, they felt, ideas which would resonate with archivists, games which have a material tie to the historical, games like Carsicon, which involves field maps, old city plans, or Cornish Smuggler, which uses imagined historical characters to add flavour to the game and the cards.
Just pop that on and show you that's Carcassonne there, and that's Cornish Smuggler. So, in taking this approach, we might think of the artists as acting as a kind of non-expert experts, or what Pierre Bourdieu called cultural intermediaries. And Bourdieu thought of intermediaries in quite a limited sense here, as a form of tastemaker, but recent academic work by people like Justin O'Connor has interpreted this notion more broadly. For O'Connor, cultural intermediaries are also translators, for him, between the language of policymakers and that of cultural producers, for example. And certainly we are Frilly have attempted to offer the archivists experiences within the game space. So they took some of the archivists to the UK Games Expo, which is a national non-digital games event, in order to help them contextualise the cultural labour ahead of them. But by defining the term games in terms of pen and paper role-playing and board games rather than video games, by choosing the UK Games Expo rather than something like EGX, which is a video games festival, and imagining and then curating the idea of the game jam with the direct involvement of the archivists, the arts organisation are actually doing more than simply translating between two sets of cultural language. Research on a recent AHRC-funded project called Cultural Intermediation has shown that intermediaries can be understood in terms of processes which connect different kinds of community into and within the creative economy. And here what we can see is intermediation as interpretation through an attempt to situate the ideas of games and game jam in a medial space that's of relative mutual comfort both to archivists and game makers alike. Because, as you might expect, expectations in the game design community tend to be a bit more grounded in the realities of a production process. The plan for the project was to operate a game jam, which is a gathering of game developers for the purpose of planning, designing and creating one or more games within a short space of time. It's usually between 24 and 72 hours. This is a mechanism that's generally, although not exclusively, focused on digital game production, as our slide earlier with all the people with their laptops might have suggested. And certainly physical prototyping of games, so making games, cards and paper and things like that, is an important part of game design. But the advantages of digital design really kick in when a game jam finishes. The objective of the game jam is to create games from beginning to end in the time allowed. And these events have got a strong history of producing innovative experimental games. And at the end of a game jam, you ideally have a playable game. It might only be part of a playable game, but it'll be a playable game. And with a digital game jam, you end up with effectively infinite copies of that game. Whereas at the end of an analog game jam, you end up with one copy of a game, drawn by hand. The designers of Cornish Smuggler, which was on the picture earlier, had to ask for £14,000 of crowdfunding to put the game into production. So that's after the game's been designed, after it's been play tested and it's ready to use. They needed £14,000 to put it into production. So board games and card games and things like that attract significant publication costs to produce high quality outputs. And these can be kept far lower in digital formats. You can publish a game to Google Play, for example, for an Android phone for $25. You can make it available on your own institutional website for, a very low cost indeed, virtually nothing. You can also deliver a digital product far more quickly and mitigate the costs of delivery in a number of ways, for example, through advertising. So you might see a tension here then between comfort and deliverability.
So tensions as between comfort, traditional, and deliverability and digital, or perhaps complications, have also become apparent around what is the purpose of this exercise. Specifically, what objectives will this game fulfil and how might it do so? And our discussions with the archivists have suggested that there's some confusion still on this score. When asked what they wanted out of this activity, archivists signal a collection of interrelated outcomes, which we'll probably all emphasise with engagement, education, income potentially, footfall, profile. Perhaps profile was the strongest of the common themes. Interestingly, and critical in thinking through the project, and perhaps why it hasn't got as far as it could have done, is that archivists felt that some of these objectives would have to be in opposition to each other, particularly those of education and income generation.
But actually for game makers, these objectives aren't irreconcilable. The selling of educational games is quite normal, and there's quite widespread guidance on a variety of ways to make money from educational games, particularly those that are free to play, and thus funded either by in-game advertising or by in-game microtransactions. So a microtransaction is when you're invited to buy a small part of something in a game for a relatively small amount of money, and it encourages you to do that for lots of little small parts, by the end of which you've spent as much as if you just bought it in the first place. In any event, all of the objectives laid out by the archivists are realisable within the product lifecycle of a fairly normal game. And the subtlety here isn't how to sell your game, but which parts of your game will make money. And actually the idea of gamification, which has already been mentioned, actually typifies the tensions that exist in the games sector and between that sector and others. Typically, gamification gets used to refer to the process of adding game-like elements to something else and offering socially focused rewards for playing that game. So these things might be badges that you can share on Facebook for doing a desired activity a certain number of times, or doing it at night, or doing it at 30,000 feet. And actually a number of games have Mile High Club awards, but probably for not what you're thinking of. But gamification is somewhat divisive amongst game developers. There's some very positive about the opportunity to bring games into a variety of activities, but others, there's a game developer and academic called Ian Bogost who's very negative about it. He's been quite scathing, and he said that gamification is bullshit. It's simply the pursuit of more gamification, and he uses the term exploitationware as a synonym for it.
So we came to realise that at the root of a lot of these complications and these tensions lie questions about language, and particularly the language of games, or rather the language of play. English is unusual amongst European languages in that we have entirely separately derived words for games and for play. So perhaps it's games as a word that's our problem. Certainly if we take a lead from the Goethe Institute, for example, the German parallel to our own British Council, we might consider play as the true cultural form. As we introduce games, the vast range of genres, classifications that this brings with it, and the politics of terms like gamer, we require particular literacies of people in order to be able to engage with them. Play, however, we might argue, is a language in which we're all made literate as children and remain literate as adults. Games are a formalised form of play, but they remain play.
Of course, this kind of hair-splitting standard academic practice. And it might not surprise you to discover that the tensions arising in our relationship with the project stem from things like questioning the distinction between history and heritage. Apparently nobody else involved in the project cares. And also the free-form and thus non-formal nature of the approach being taken by the artists. Freely seek an organic outcome from this project, and on reflection, that's perhaps entirely appropriate. Emergence is a valuable quality of play. And this kind of style of gameplay has proven really, really popular over the last few years. Grand Theft Auto, which we talked about earlier, is what's known as a sandbox game. It has emergent play elements, and Minecraft the same is another game, which is, perhaps not necessarily what you'd imagine as a game. It doesn't make you play in any particular way. It gives you tools and invites you to have fun. So not only is this project about play, but the way that it's conducted, or being conducted, or hopefully will be conducted, is playful in itself. Oh, I've got another bit. In closing, we also have to consider our fifth community, the one we haven't really discussed yet, which is the audience. At this stage, the project hasn't developed far enough to define or engage a specific audience, but we've given thought to the question of what happens if there's no audience. So what happens if we make a game and no one plays it? Ideally, game jams produce finished games, but they often produce nothing that anyone really wants to play. And even if a game's made, there's a very real possibility that it will be rejected. It'll either be thought of as a bad game, perhaps, or as a form of, or rejected as a form of engagement with these particular archives. And there's a further tension to describe here around the uncertainty that exists around the cultural status of games, and whether or not they can consider to be culture, for example, or art. And certainly there's historically been little opportunity or support to produce games which question or which force engagement with difficult ideas. And it remains easier still to get non-commercial funding for an artistic game by pretending that it's not really a game.
But moving away again from the idea of games to the idea of play, it might not matter if there's no product from this process of production. There are always risks to organic projects which try to bridge communities, and achieving understanding between such a broad group is difficult. It's clear that everyone is still enthusiastic about the project, but the uncertainty that exists about what might happen makes engagement between those communities problematic. The free-form organic approach of the artists acts to encourage this engagement in a way that's playful. They want game designers to play with the archives, with the richness of the collections, but they want the archivists to play as well. As academic observers or researchers, we're unsure precisely how our role is going to play out in this, but we will need to respond to whatever happens as it happens. But in presenting this as play rather than as gaming, and in seeking an organic outcome, what We Are Freely is really doing is providing a space for playful encounters between the archives and the games communities. We have at present absolutely no idea who's going to win, or even if winning counts.
Thank you.
Excellent.